Millionaire Ethan Whitmore, CEO of Horizon and Deaf since childhood, had already grown used to one of the worst pains a person can feel: eating dinner every night in silence, surrounded by wealth and power, but with no one real at the table. That night, as he pushed his food around without tasting it, the dining room door opened and Elena, the house cleaner, rushed in, holding her little girl by the hand, a 4-year-old crying so loudly it seemed to rip through the air. Nobody in that penthouse had been able to calm the girl down until she walked up to Ethan, climbed onto the chair beside him, and, as if by some small miracle, the crying slowly faded and turned into a different kind of silence, one that felt less heavy. That was when he noticed what the little girl was clutching in her tiny hand and realized that this meeting was no accident. Our stories have been traveling far. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments. And if this kind of story speaks to your heart, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next twists life can bring. Ethan Whitmore was the kind of man everyone pointed to as the definition of success, heir to a chain of luxury hotels spread across New York, Miami, and Los Angeles, a respected CEO, a familiar face on business magazine covers, a living symbol of wealth and power. Outside, the cars that stopped in front of his building looked like they had rolled straight out of a commercial. Inside, the private elevator carried him up to a glass-walled penthouse overlooking Manhattan. But that night, while the city roared below with horns, sirens, and rushed voices, none of that reached Ethan. He sat alone at the head of a table far too long for one person, staring at a plate that was already getting cold, wrapped in a heavy silence that didn't come only from his deafness. It was the kind of silence that's born when nobody is really waiting for you at the end of the day. He'd lost his hearing at 7 years old after an infection that wasn't treated properly, and from then on he learned the hard way that the world doesn't have much patience for anyone who doesn't fit the mold. At school, kids mocked his gestures, laughed at his attempts to follow conversations that moved too fast, and many adults confused his struggle to communicate with a lack of intelligence. Over time, Ethan discovered it was easier to build walls than to beg for understanding. He grew up, studied, took over the family business, and turned that pain into cold efficiency. He learned to read lips, to control meetings, to command entire rooms with a steady gaze and impeccable posture. On the outside, it looked like arrogance. On the inside, it was just defense. On that particular night, though, his defenses looked tired. His hearing aid lay switched off on the sideboard, next to an expensive watch frozen at an hour when most families would be eating together, talking loudly, arguing about small things. Ethan liked to take the device off at home. He told himself it was to give his head a break, but deep down, it was so he wouldn't have to face the echo of voices that didn't exist there. The aligned silverware, the perfect tablecloth, the expensive wine within reach, everything looked like part of a set designed for someone who never showed up. He cut a piece of meat, chewed slowly, and felt once again that uncomfortable sense that he had achieved everything the world applauds, except what really fills a person up. Sometimes, walking down the hallway lined with framed photos, he caught himself staring at old images, ribbon cuttings, award nights, parties, always surrounded by smiling people. In every picture, open mouths frozen in laughter seemed to scream a kind of happiness he no longer heard or felt. In that apartment high above the city, success smelled like disinfectant and gleamed like polished marble. But it didn't sound like conversation in the kitchen, or a child's laughter, or someone asking how his day had been. Ethan knew how to manage numbers, contracts, mergers, but he no longer knew what to do with his own loneliness. And it was on this ordinary night, apparently just like all the others, that a small, unexpected presence would cross that border of silence and start, without him realizing it, the biggest turning point of his life. The kitchen door opened slowly, letting a strip of warm yellow light slip into the dining room and the muffled clatter of pans being put away. Ethan didn't even look over, used to the quiet comings and goings of the staff. But this time, it wasn't an adult who stepped through the doorway. It was a 4-year-old girl in simple pajamas with faded cartoon prints, holding a stuffed animal by one ear. She stopped halfway into the room, staring at the huge table, the shining silverware, the wall clock, and the man alone at the far end, wrapped in more wealth than she had seen in her whole life. Behind her came Elena, the cleaner who had started just a few days earlier. Her hair was tied back any which way, her uniform already a little creased, her eyes carrying the look of someone who is always apologizing for existing. She dropped the cleaning rag in the cart and rushed forward. Her lips poured out desperate apologies, but for Ethan it was all image. Not knowing he was deaf, she pointed at the girl, mouthed, "I'm sorry," and made the automatic gesture of shrinking in front of the power of the man who paid her wages. The little girl, however, didn't seem intimidated by the arrogance of the room. Nora, as her mother called her, took a few more curious steps forward. Her eyes traveled over the expensive arrangements, the food he had barely touched, and finally stopped on the hearing aid lying on the table beside his water glass. Most adults pretended not to see it. She didn't. She pointed straight at the device, then at her own ear, and finally looked up at Ethan's face, as if asking, "Why don't you wear it?" He frowned, not sure whether to feel invaded or exposed. Elena tried to pull her daughter back, but Nora slipped out of her hand and walked right up to the head of the table. She set the stuffed animal down on the tablecloth, as if she were offering company to the man eating alone. Then, slowly, she exaggerated the movement of her lips, forming a simple sentence he had learned to read many times as a child. "You look sad." The word sad hit him harder than any sound he might ever hear again. And if you, watching this, have ever felt that kind of loneliness, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and keep walking with us through these stories that poke at places wealth can't fix. Elena, red with embarrassment, finally managed to reach her daughter and started apologizing, her mouth trembling slightly. To her, the whole scene was a disaster. Her child crossing the formal dining room, the perfect tablecloth now holding a cheap toy, and the most powerful man in the house looking straight at them. Ethan watched it all and read every apology on her lips, even without hearing a word. It was exactly the kind of situation where he would normally stand up and walk away, reinforcing the distance between his wealth and the simple life of the woman who scrubbed his floors. But that night was not like the others. Instead of leaving, he nudged his plate slightly to the side and picked up a pen from the sideboard. He motioned for Elena and Nora to stay where they were. The mother instinctively tried to step aside, but the girl stayed put, staring at the man at the head of the table as if she were weighing whether she could trust him. Ethan wrote a few words on a notepad, flipped the page slowly, and held it out so Elena could read. "It's okay, she's not bothering me." The relief that washed over her face was as visible as any loud noise. Nora, curious, walked around the chair and leaned toward the page. She stared at the lines of ink, then pointed at the writing and at him, as if she were asking whether that was the voice he used. Ethan let out half a smile, the kind that almost never appeared, and nodded. Then, in a sudden impulse no one expected, the girl dragged one of the side chairs over, climbed up with effort, and stood there at table height, examining the millionaire's nearly untouched plate. Elena tried to pull her down, but he lifted a calm hand, asking her to let the child stay. For the first time in a very long time, that dinner stopped being a cold ritual and turned into a scene with real people. While Nora tapped the silverware gently and bounced the stuffed animal lightly on the table, Ethan picked up the hearing aid, looked at it for a heartbeat longer than usual, and without explaining anything, brought it up to his ear. It wasn't some instant miracle gesture, but it was a beginning. And even if the world outside stayed as noisy as ever, something in that shared silence between a powerful man, a humble cleaner, and her daughter already showed that the turning point of that night had begun. After that dinner, broken and remade by Nora's unexpected entrance, nobody really knew how to put the protocol of the house back together. Elena was still trying to disappear into her uniform, apologizing with her eyes as she picked the stuffed animal up from the table. Ethan, however, didn't seem willing to go back to his old script of elegant solitude. He wrote another sentence on the notepad and slid it slowly toward her. "Have you two eaten yet?" The look she gave him back said a lot at once: shame, exhaustion, and a bit of wounded pride. She shook her head, trying to minimize it. "We'll eat later in the little room," she murmured, knowing he would read more on her face than in the sound. But there was a detail nobody looking from the outside could see. Behind all that wealth, Ethan could recognize from a mile away the posture of someone who had learned to survive with very little. He motioned for them to stay, gave a subtle signal to a staff member to bring extra plates, and, before anyone could question it, pulled out another chair at the table. Elena froze. Sitting there in the main dining room, next to the owner of the penthouse, felt wrong on every level. "I really can't, sir," she tried to protest, but he was already writing another line. "Tonight you can. It's just food, not power." Nora was the first to accept, because children don't complicate what's simple. She climbed back up onto the chair, legs swinging happily in the air, her joy shattering any leftover arrogance in that room. Elena sat down slowly, still perched on the edge of the chair, not leaning back like someone ready to jump up and run if anyone told her to. While they ate in silence, Ethan noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way Elena cut her daughter's food first, the care she took not to spill anything on the expensive cloth, the way her eyes scanned the room as if she were apologizing for taking up space there. For you watching this is the kind of moment that reminds us that behind titles and numbers, every person is hungry for respect, for care, for the feeling of being truly seen. If you love stories like this, where wealth and humility end up at the same table and nothing goes back to the way it was, it's worth subscribing and staying close. There's still a lot about this night you need to see. And the next part begins exactly when someone in the family discovers the millionaire has stopped eating dinner alone. The next morning, the boardroom on Horizon's top floor was full, but the atmosphere had nothing to do with celebration. Screens were lit, charts were frozen in place, and right in the middle of the main screen there was a still frame from the previous night's dinner. Ethan at the head of the table with Elena and Nora seated beside him. The one who had ordered the security footage pulled was Thomas Hale, Ethan's older cousin and the company's most aggressive public face, the kind of man who trusts his own expensive suit more than any human bond. He pointed at the screen as if it were evidence of a crime. "Do you have any idea what this scene sends to investors, board members, the press?" he snapped. "The wealth of this family is not a toy for a cleaner to play princess with her kid at the main table." Ethan followed everything in silence, reading lips, but he didn't need much effort to catch the poison behind the words. The real issue wasn't protocol. It was pure arrogance dressed up as protecting the brand. Some directors looked away, uncomfortable. Others agreed quietly, gripped by that familiar fear of people who would rather stand with power even when they know something is wrong. Thomas kept going. "People like that look at a man like you and see a winning lottery ticket. Tonight it's dinner, tomorrow it's a lawsuit, a scandal, a support check. You don't know how these people work, Ethan, but I do." Every sentence was loaded with prejudice, as if someone humble couldn't sit at the same table without some hidden agenda. But there was something Thomas couldn't see. Ethan knew in his own skin what it was to be treated as a problem from childhood, just for being different. Watching Elena and Nora being quietly pushed into the same category of disposable inconveniences lit up something inside him he didn't even know was still there. While Thomas suggested fixing everything, with a simple order to fire Elena and ban any child from the penthouse, Ethan took his notepad, drew a deep breath, and started writing, his handwriting firm, more to organize himself on the inside than to impress anyone. Thomas finished with, "We go back to normal," as if normal were just another word for cold. When he stood up, Ethan let the silence work in his favor for a few seconds. Then he held up the pad, a sentence written in big, clear letters. "People are not trash you use and throw away." Elena stays, Nora too. The room froze. Thomas tried to cut in, but Ethan spoke, his voice still a little rusty, but strong enough to cut through the glass. "If our wealth is so fragile that a child with a stuffed bear can bring it down, maybe the problem isn't them." He pointed at the image on the screen. "Last night, for the first time in years, someone sat at my table without wanting anything but a little attention. That's not a risk. That's a chance for a turning point. If anyone here feels threatened by humility, maybe they're clinging too hard to their own power." For you watching, this is exactly where the story starts pressing on wounds a lot of people know well. Have you ever felt someone's eyes on you in a place just because of your clothes, your job, or the neighborhood you came from? Have you ever been made to feel out of place, even though you did nothing wrong? If that has happened to you or to someone you love, tell us in the comments, because knowing it didn't happen only to us already lightens the weight a little. Ethan walked out of that meeting with his decision made, but the system wasn't going to swallow it quietly. The next blow wouldn't come in the boardroom. It would come downstairs, where Elena thought she was just doing her job. On the service floor, the board's meeting arrived as rumor and half phrases. While she mopped the hallway leading to the private elevator, Elena heard bits of conversation. Dining room video. Thomas stormed out. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. Each word seemed to say the same thing. That world of wealth she only passed through in uniform could swallow people like her whole at any moment. Nora slept in a makeshift crib in a corner of the storage room, clinging to her honey-colored bear. Just seeing her daughter there, so small next to so much power, made Elena's stomach twist between fear and gratitude. She was called into the admin office by an older supervisor, Mrs. Peterson, who always looked like she had a scolding ready under her blazer. Mrs. Peterson closed the door, sat behind the desk, and went straight to the point. Thomas had come downstairs furious after the meeting, ranting about protocols, image, and legal risks. He had said that a child had no business being in a millionaire's penthouse, that it made the place look like a family home, not a CEO's residence. The supervisor, visibly uncomfortable, relayed the message. From that moment on, Nora would no longer be allowed upstairs, and if the situation stayed complicated, maybe it would be best for Elena to look for another opportunity. The words were wrapped in formality, but the message was simple. You are the disposable part of this story. Elena left the room feeling like the floor had disappeared. Back in the storage room, she leaned her back against the wall, breathing deep so she wouldn't fall apart in front of her daughter. Up there, wealth meant people making decisions about her life without even knowing how much a pack of diapers cost. She grabbed a sheet of notepad paper from the reception desk, sat on a crate, and started writing, because she had understood something important. Talking to Ethan was hard, but he read everything. In the note, she thanked him for the chance, apologized for the trouble, and said that if it was better for him and for the company, she would step away on her own. Every word felt like a stab to her own humility, but it also felt like the only way to protect Nora from a war that wasn't hers. At the end of the afternoon, with her daughter awake and restless in her arms, Elena went up to the penthouse kitchen with the folded envelope in her hand. Her plan was to leave it on the counter and slip away before anyone saw her. But when she pushed the door open, she found Ethan alone, in a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, stirring a mug of coffee as if trying to stretch the last bit of warmth out of the day. He looked up and saw the envelope, saw the backpack on her shoulders, saw Nora on her hip. For a second, the three of them froze. Then he pointed at the paper, then at her chest, a silent question. Elena swallowed hard and answered in a low voice, knowing he would read more in her expression than in her words. "It's just to say thank you and to stop causing trouble. We're already leaving." Ethan stared at her for far too long for that to be just a polite goodbye. He walked over to the counter, held out his hand for the envelope, opened it right there and read slowly, his eyes running over the same line twice, as if he wanted to be absolutely sure he understood. When he finished, he didn't hand the paper back. He pulled the notepad he kept in his sweatshirt pocket, wrote a few words in the firm handwriting of someone who has used more pen than voice, and turned it so she could see. "I'm the one who decides who stays here, not Thomas. You're not a problem, you're a person." Then he lifted his eyes again, holding the pad up between them like a small shield against all the arrogance circling that place. "If anyone has to leave for not knowing how to use their power with humility," he said slowly, shaping each syllable with care, "it's not you." That same night, the dining table in the penthouse looked like a different place. There were no important guests, no lined-up waiters, no rows of expensive silver. Just 3 simple plates, a glass of juice with a colourful straw, and a bowl of mashed potatoes that Nora was pressing with her fork, as if she were shaping a new world. Ethan spent a few seconds staring at the head chair, the one where he had eaten alone for years, surrounded by a silence even the TV couldn't fill. Instead of sitting there, he pulled out a chair at the side of the table, closer to Elena and her daughter, and before he sat down, he placed the hearing aid behind his left ear. The soft click, as it turned on, sounded almost like an act of faith. For the first time in a long time, he was choosing to listen, even knowing not everything that came from the world was kind. Elena, still not sure where to put her hands, kept glancing at the crystal glasses and folded napkins as if she could break everything just by breathing too loudly. That kind of wealth had never been meant for someone like her, used to eating lunch in 10 minutes in the staff break room. "If you'd rather, we can eat in the kitchen," she offered, staring down at her plate. Ethan shook his head, pointed at the whole table, and wrote a few words on the pad. "I spent half my life building all this to impress people who never stay. Tonight, I want this table for the ones who do." She gave a shy smile, eyes filling with tears, because it was the first time someone with that much power had looked straight at her and said she wasn't just the cleaner. Nora, oblivious to the symbolic weight of that moment, decided it was time to do the impossible again. She reached up and touched the hearing aid gently, just like she had on the first day, but this time without fear, only curiosity. She looked straight into Ethan's eyes and repeated, in her own clumsy way, the same sign he had taught her in the playroom earlier that day, an open hand leaving the lips and moving outward, the sign for "thank you." Then she pointed at him, at herself, and at the empty chair by his side, in a conversation made only of gestures that still said everything. "Stay with us." Ethan felt his chest tighten, not with the old pain of someone who always watched life from the outside, but with the slow realization that he was, little by little, walking into a home he never imagined he could have. Later that night, when Nora had fallen asleep with her head resting on his shoulder and Elena was clearing the plates with careful movements, Ethan picked up his phone and opened the banking app, not to check numbers but to start sketching changes. He set up an internal horizon fund to support employees with young children. He wrote down the idea of turning one of the empty rooms on his floor into a support space for kids. He drafted an email to the legal department asking for a review of the company's accessibility policies, not just for him, but for everyone Horizon would ever hire. For the first time, the wealth in his hands felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. Before going to sleep, already in his quiet bedroom, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed with his hearing aid still on, listening to the distant hum of the city below. He took the same old notebook he had been using since he was a boy and wrote a simple sentence, one anyone could read, but that in that moment belonged only to him. Tonight, this home didn't get smaller because simple people walked in. It got bigger because silence doesn't rule me anymore. Beside the words, he drew a crooked-eared stuffed bear and a tiny hand holding a hearing aid. He didn't need anything else to understand that the great turning point so many people look for in self-help books had come to him in the insistent crying of a cleaner's daughter. Out in the hallway, Elena did one last walk through as she always did, checking that everything was in place. The difference was that this time she didn't feel like she was walking through forbidden territory. She knew there would still be side eyes, gossip about ulterior motives, maybe new attempts from Thomas to claw back his power. But she also knew that at the most important table in that apartment, someone had chosen to stay beside her and Nora, not out of pity, but out of recognition. For someone who had spent a lifetime being told she was replaceable, that already felt like the beginning of a family, even if nobody had dared to say that word out loud yet. By the end of that night, it wasn't the city outside that had changed. What changed was the home at the top. The penthouse that had always been a backdrop for cold meetings and lonely dinners had become a place of children's laughter, shared plates, and decisions made with the heart, not just with spreadsheets. Ethan didn't stop being a millionaire, didn't give up his power, didn't forget the wealth he held in his hands. What he did was something much rarer. He decided to use all of that as a bridge, not a wall, so that Elena and Nora would stop being the cleaner and the cleaner's kid and become people with a reserved place at the table. Maybe at some point in your life, you've also been treated like you were invading a space that wasn't yours. Maybe it was because of the job you do, the clothes you wear, the neighborhood you come from, or the way you speak. Or maybe you've been on the other side, suddenly realizing you were repeating an arrogance that didn't match the kind of person you want to be. And that's where this story leaves you with a question it can't answer for you. In Ethan's place, what would you do with the power you have? And in Elena's place, would you have the courage to stay where people always told you didn't belong? If any part of this story stirred something in you, the little girl calming a man who lived in silence, the cleaner facing her fear of losing everything, or the millionaire choosing humility where distance had always ruled, tell us in the comments. Say which scene touched you the most, or if you've lived something similar, even on a much smaller scale. And if this kind of narrative helps you see life with different eyes, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. There is still a lot to tell about wealthy people who are forced to learn that what really matters can't be measured on a bank statement.